Hi there, I'm Dave Butler.
I'm Grace Freeman.
Welcome to Don't Miss This.
Our scripture study class.
Guys, we've nailed that down. If it's your first time here, that has taken 18 practices to get that intro right where it's at. So hope you can appreciate it. This is our.
Tell us you like it.
This is our little class, our scripture study class. We follow the Come Follow Me schedule, and we move through each week's reading, and we point out things that we think you don't want to miss. We're in the Book of Mormon this year, and we're at the end of summertime if you're in the top half of the earth.
True.
And end of winter if you're in the other.
So
everyone's happy, except if you're going back to school, unless you're a mom. But this time and next time if you're new to the Book of Mormon, are known among Book of Mormon reading people as the war chapters. So there is war all throughout the book. But for some reason, there is just this big emphasis and a lot of detail on this great battle, several battles, which encompass a war between the Nephites and the Lamanite armies. And just a whole lot of description about very, very specific battle plans and outcomes and strategies. And there's just so much in here about the wars. And we called today a happier time because this comes from one of the sections. It's a scripture in one of the sections that we're in. And I really like it because there's two things just at the beginning that I think we want to say. And one is, this is not a new thought, but there have been, when we talk about Mormon putting together what he's going to put in the Book of Mormon, Mormon compiles all these records together. So you ask yourself, why did you write so much about the war chapters in the Book of Mormon? And he says in his book in the end, I saw your day. And we would assume he saw our needs. And so he puts in these strategies of war, I think for a time when we would be in intense battle.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about, sometimes I like to think about when we talk about Armageddon, that maybe it's going to be a literal battle. But sometimes I wonder, are we maybe not already fighting it? Is it not this battle for souls that has been going on and is going on and is increasing in intensity? And maybe these chapters are in here to help us out with that. But we called it this happier time because if that's the case, I mean, legit it's the case, right? Wouldn't you say, just give me 3 words to describe mortality right now. Surely, if we're playing Family Feud, someone's going to say a battle.
For sure.
A majority of people, when they get to the other side of the veil after death, they're going to talk about all their friends. How was life for you? Oh, it was this, and it was this, and it was this. And certainly in that list, they're going to say, and oh, that was a battle, you know? And so there's something about that. And then this hopeful truth that you can find a happier time. Never was there a happier time. That does not make sense. When you're in the middle of, if you're studying about the Vietnam War and someone's writing in their journal and they're like, never were we happier than in the trenches. You're just that makes no sense.
Yeah.
And so it gives this hopeful idea, this hope to lean into that says, even in a time of great distress and a time of great battle, you can experience happiness and hope. So, this time and next time, just so you know, are part 1 and part 2 of the war chapters. A lot of war going on, but I think really
and a lot
cool
of
stuff.
chapters and going on.
Yeah, these are your longest reading chunks of I think the whole year.
Yeah,
you got 10 chapters this week and 10 chapters next week. So we didn't decide that. Don't attack.
It's not our fault.
Us.
It's not our fault.
So,
and we're not going to cover everything perfectly.
Yeah.
So just so you know, because there's so many chapters, just find, if you're a teacher or if you're a reader, just find your happiness. Find your place.
Yeah.
Be okay with that.
What you want to study. But particularly as a teacher, I think a great teaching skill to learn, and it's hard to give up wanting to teach everything, is to find and choose those things that are most relevant to the group that you are teaching. If you're a parent with kids, find the thing that's most relevant and focus there. Depending on the class that you're teaching at church, find the thing that is most relevant. And that's where I think you ought to focus. It's that's a skill to be able to say no to things that you really want to share.
Yeah.
So we do that every single week. But in particular, these really long chapters, I think would be extra important.
For sure.
Okay, let's jump in. Chapter 43. We're calling this one Battle Ready. It matches the page in the journal because we're thinking about this concept with all the war chapters. All the verses on here are from chapter 43. And let's actually show the worksheet up
yeah.
on here for anybody who's watching this. There are particular verses that go under these little shields that you can write in that we talk about. Moroni lived in it. Moroni is the head of the Nephite army. And he does certain things as the leader of that army to prepare the people to get them battle ready. And there's a lot of talk of preparation. And there's a lot of talk of what do we do in a time of battle. And this becomes great as we apply this to our own battles that we're facing, whatever they may be right now. What's it look like both to prepare for that and what's it look like to engage in that spiritual battle that we're in. So you can use this to fill these in. We have some examples. I'm going to show you some of the verses in here that you can do this with in 43. But again, you have 20 chapters you can do this with. And this is a really cool way to teach these chapters too, is to just say, hey, you take these verses and you take these verses and you take these verses. What lessons are we learning about our own spiritual battles?
And I think it's really cool that we're like right now, it's kind of right at the time like you're about to start getting into school again. Kind of life is changing. It's like you're about to enter into a new phase of the year. And I just think it's such a cool moment to stop and be like, okay, let's get battle ready for the next part of this year.
Yeah.
Things are changing. Let's all get on the same page. I think that could be a really cool discussion to talk about. Like, you're kind of in a moment of preparedness. You're going to Walmart and like going to the school section and buying all your stuff to get ready for school probably. What are you doing right now to be like spiritual ready?
Yeah.
I just think that could be
fun. And I would really like to focus on like, these are the strategies the Lord has inspired. These are the assets that the Lord has given. Like, make this don't focus maybe so much on the battle, but what the Lord's done to help us in the battle, and it can be a lot more inspiring. So you jump into verse 43, and I just love in the very first verse where it talks about Alma, who's a leader.
Chapter 43.
Okay, what did I say?
Verse 43.
Yeah, but verse 43 is going to be so good. I just want to see what it is right now. It's like, they fought exceedingly. Yeah, that is so good. Yeah. Okay, but chapter 43 is where I really want to take you. And I think there's something that some of you have felt in verse 1 where it talks about Alma as a leader, and he says he himself could not rest, so he went forth. That there is this divine restlessness that God will give us sometimes where we're just like, this is important. I have people I love. I have causes that I love, and I can't sit back and do nothing about it. And I think you may have felt that before, and he feels it, and so do a lot of the other people here, because you have like this Lamanite army that's forming together with the intention of destroying the Nephites. And let
me say this really fast. One thing I love also that is already just in the first 3 verses is the fact that there is a war going on, but also in verse number 1, that did not stop the declaring of the gospel.
Cool, yeah.
And in fact, there might never have been a time that people needed the good news as much as they did in the middle of this war. And I love that was a moment that they said, listen, just so you know, that period of time was Alma could not rest. He had to go tell more people about the gospel. That was happening at the exact same time. I love that it's like both of those together.
It's really cool.
Anyways,
it's really cool.
Yeah.
And it makes you feel like the reading and the hearing and the taking in of the word are going to be super valuable no matter what the circumstances are. Where you're almost like, I don't think scriptures are what we want to be reading right now. We want to be reading war plan books or something. And it's like, no, there's something about what you said, being connected to the good news, being a reminder of who God is. And we're going to see that actually throughout all of these. There's something that's really interesting in 43 about the Lamanites trying to preserve the hatred that the people have toward the Nephites. This is going to be a theme throughout the war chapters, is almost like you see the 2 different sides, right? Battling against each other. And they're both trying to preserve something. In verse 7, the Lamanites are trying to preserve hatred. And in verse 9, they're trying to preserve a different cause, the privileges of liberty and worship. And it's interesting that both sides are trying to stir something up. They're trying to make sure something doesn't die off. And the Lamanites are like, I want you to keep your hatred. I want to keep reminding you how you've been wronged. I want to keep you bitter. I want to keep your heart hard against this. And both leadership styles show someone's trying to preserve some sort of emotion, some sort of intention in both of their sides.
Well, and I think it's really interesting because how they do it in verse number 7, to preserve the hatred, they give them a leader that kind of like inflicts that and reminds them of it. And in verse number 9, it talks so much about their families and the people they're surrounded with. And I think it's so interesting that the preservation of hatred and anger and the preservation of belief and worship and adoration happens to be people. Who are you surrounding yourself with? And are the people you're surrounding with like helping you preserve anger or helping you preserve adoration to God?
That's such a good principle and thought, particularly in a world where we have access to so many people's opinions and so many people's thoughts, that we would just like, those are now included in the list of the people who are inspiring and preserving things in you. Like who you follow, right, on
100%.
TikTok, Instagram, whatever, is that they're preserving something in you, and what is it? And particularly because like a lot of social media algorithms put you into an echo chamber. Of like those same.
You get stuck in it.
Yeah, so it's interesting they use that word stir, that he stirs them up, because you think of that stirring as like almost like a circular. You're just stuck in this
over and over and over.
But also could be a good thing, like to be stirred up in gratitude and, and all those things too. So I think there's something really important at the beginning here when it talks about these two opposing sides. It's just something that is a reality of what the world that we live in is, that there is an enemy to faith, and there is an enemy to goodness, and there is an adversary against your progression and against your happiness. And I wish that wasn't true, but Second Nephi taught us that one of the great tactics of the adversary is going to be that there is no adversary, that he wants to try and trick you into like not paying any attention to him. And I think it's value to remember there is someone, you are being attacked. We are in a time of battle. I hate to be the bearer of that news. I'm an optimist. I'm a non-battle person. I'm a pacifist, right? But we live in a time of battle, and it's just important to know that, so something has to be done about it. And that's the need to be battle ready, because you didn't pick the fight, someone picked it with you. And you are in it. And verse 14 says, they were obliged to contend. And so are all of us. We are obliged to fight for our faith and fight for our families and fight for our liberties and fight for our beliefs. Like we just, if we want to keep them, we are obliged to do that. So here are some of the things that we learned. And again, you can use all these just however you want, or you can take the verses. The bottom ones, repeat verses. And I would actually use these bottom 4 as just like 4 extra that you may find in here. And use the back and use your note pages. But here's a couple examples of what we mean that you can kind of pull out and apply. Verse 19, Moroni had prepared his people with breastplates and with arm shields and with shields to defend their heads, and were dressed with thick clothing. The battle that they were involved in required this particular type of army. I have a good friend, Dale, and he has been in military service for now several decades. And I've heard him talk about the advancement of military gear over the years that he's been in the military, and the particular areas of the world that he's been in, the different types of defense that you need to engage in because of that. And I just think that like Moroni sees that, and this is what people are going to need. They're for sure going to need breastplates, and they're going to need arm shields because of the kind of like weaponry or whatever they're being attacked with. And I just like thinking to myself, like, okay, what am I preparing my people with and myself with? What's my breastplate? And what's my helmet? What are my arm shields? What am I going to do? It says to defend their heads. Like fill that in with like to defend my heart, to defend my evenings, to defend my time, to defend my affections, whatever it is. What is it that I'm going to prepare? But there's some sort of defense that he prepares, right? Another example, verse 23. There's 2 in this one. I wrote one up there. In verse 23, it says that Moroni sent spies into the wilderness to watch their camp. This one's kind of intriguing to me because as a dad in particular of teenage kids, I'm trying to keep an eye on what the threats are against them. I'm trying to make myself aware. I'm watching the camp. I want to know what's threatening my middle schoolers, what's happening at the high school, what are the things that they are hearing, what are the ideas that are being put into their head. I don't want to become obsessed with it and caught up in it, but I want to be aware so that I know how to defend I know which breastplates to arm them with and which head plates to arm them with, because I know the ideas that they're hearing, and I want to defend against those particular ideas.
Well, and I love that it's just spies, because he didn't send his whole army there. He didn't go himself. It was just, let me keep my eye on that, but let me live here. I'm going to be present right here in this moment.
That's a cool thought.
I just need to have my eyes over there.
Yeah.
Just see.
That's cool. Another one that's in 23 is that he went to Alma. He sent people to Alma and he said, will you ask the Lord what we should do? We live in a time where we have Almas, where we have prophets, seers, and revelators. They are providing insight and strategies and inspiration that can help us in the battles that we are in today. We talk about a people believing in living prophets who speak to the times that we live in. And I think one of the ways that we receive inspiration from the Lord is through our Almas. And another way we receive inspiration is when we ask. We too can inquire of the Lord whither we should go. What should we do? Help us in my particular situation with my particular kids. And I think that's an important prayer to pray specifically. You know, just, I know we know that and that God will help us, but let's ask that direct question to him. How do I help so-and-so by name? 24, I love that Moroni realizes that there's going to be an attack on the weaker part of the people. We are so painfully aware of our weaknesses. Let's not just beat ourselves up over them. Let's just realize, like, oh, that's a particular weakness I have, and I should be particular about protecting that particular weak part of me. So anyways, there's so many things that are in here that you could just keep going through. I just kind of wanted to show you some of them so that you can kind of see, oh, that's what you can do with some of these verses, is you are learning, applying what they're doing in their battles with your spiritual battles. I think you're going to find, though, that there's so much of this that is about the heart and about the faith as well. Yes, they're in a physical battle, but what they're actually trying to defend are not just their lives, but their hearts and their faith as well. So it's not too much of a stretch to say we're learning principles of defending our faith and our hearts in chapters like this.
Yeah.
So anyways, so much more that's in there that you're gonna love and do. Some of these are gonna come up again, so we're just gonna.
Well, and I would even say sometimes there's like 20 chapters that kind of all follow the same pattern of battles and war. And sometimes for me, when I have that many chapters, I get overwhelmed, or especially when there's stories that might be a little bit harder to understand or follow just because of the names and how many there are and different storylines to keep up with. Sometimes it's like overwhelming to know how to read it in a way that's effective. I would even just keep going and build your list for the next 20 chapters.
Yeah.
And you will find more and more things of how to get battle ready. I think that could be a really cool theme to just keep from like chapter 43 to the end of the book of Alma. I think you could find stuff to add to this list.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of cool to like, you could almost have two lists, which is one is like, this is the lesson that I learned, and then now this is how I could implement it in my particular situation.
For sure.
Right, here's the general lesson, right? Like they prepared his people, okay? Now, what can I do to prepare my people?
Which would be the coolest lesson before you go back to school.
Yeah.
Of get really like scripture based here and then really get it applicable together in a discussion.
So awesome.
Yeah. This next two chapters, chapter 44 and chapter 45, what is going to happen in chapter 44 is it's like going to be a whole thing. They're going to try to get the Lamanites to surrender. They're going to say no. They're going to go to war. They win. It's really exciting. It's kind of this good moment. But before that happens, I think you kind of get this glimpse into Moroni and his people in a very personal, almost it feels like intimate way of like, oh, this is really who they are as a people. And you'll find verses throughout this whole chapter that you love. I'm just going to share a couple at the very beginning because I love that he introduces his people and he says in the end of verse 3, and now you see that you cannot destroy this, our faith. They brought their faith with them into every moment of their life, even into war. And they knew that it was strong enough to not be destroyed. That's why they brought it, is because they said, this is more valuable than any of our weapons. This is more valuable to us than however strong our arms are. This is everything to us, is what we believe. And I heard the most tender story of my entire life today. And there's this mom that was a little scouts leader in the olden days, okay? And she had her little troop or whatever.
Back in those ancient times.
In the ancient days. And she was a Boy Scouts leader, and she had her little troop. She loved them, and they had like their like uniforms that they would wear every single day to scouts, but they also had their little booklets that were called Faith in God. They're like, it's like their little, it's like a little booklet of like goals for their spirituality, right? I didn't have faith in God. I was a girl, so I don't know what it was, but I think that. And she would tell them every day before the activity, she'd be like, hey, make sure you wear your uniform and you bring your faith in God. Wear your uniform, bring your faith in God. And she'd send out texts and all that stuff. And there was this little boy that finally got old enough to go to scouts. And he got the text and it was, wear your uniform, bring your faith in God. And he like showed up and he like got there and he was like wearing his uniform and he walked in and she was like, I'm so happy you're here. Like your first time, like, woohoo, like we can't wait for you to be in scouts with us. And then she's like, did you bring your book? And he was like, my book? What book? And she said, oh, your Faith in God book. And he looks and he's like, it's a book? And she was like, yes, like, here's your book. And he's like, I thought I had to bring my testimony to share. And I just love that line of like, bring your faith in God. And like it used to be a book, but why can we not just say that all the time? Like, hey, like, what do you need me to bring to this? And, oh, just bring your faith in God. That's enough for me. Or someone is at the hospital. Oh, what can I bring you? Just your faith in God is enough for us. And I love that lesson that little boy taught, that it's just like, wait, you can take that with you. And I love that these people did. That like that's how they entered into battle, is they said, what do we need to bring? And yeah, they had weapons and they had armor and they had everything that they needed for battle. But the thing that was most important to them is that they showed up with their faith in God.
And that, I think, matters. And you're going to see that again and again and again throughout the war chapters. And particularly next week with the 2,000 stripling warriors, right? What they brought that was most valuable was their faith in God. That was the turning factor in all of these wars. It's what they brought. And I just think as we approach our situations that we are in, that our friends are in, that our family is in, do not disregard or discount the impact it is to come into a situation with your faith in God. There's something about when you're in a time of tragedy or unexpectedness and things have turned upside down that weigh heavy on your faith, that dilute hope and faith, and it is so valuable to come in to a situation and maybe you don't go in because you're like, I don't even know what I can offer, and how powerful it is to remember you can bring your faith in God, and that will make a difference in a battle.
For sure. And I think it's so cool in verse number 5 because he says, like, listen, I love how he addresses God, and he says, the all-powerful God who has strengthened our arms. What a title for who God is and what he will do. But then he's going to go through, after he mentions God, and he's going to mention their families and their belief in the scriptures. And then he says, to which we owe all our happiness and by all that is most dear unto us. And at the end of the day, they were in the middle of a war, but that was not their priority. That was not the most important part of their life. Their battle was their circumstance, but their heart was in all of the things that he just mentioned. Their faith, their families, their people, that is where they had all of their value. And what happens in verse 45 is so fascinating to me. Because,
chapter 45. Gotcha.
Payback. And in chapter 45, what happens is in the end of 44, they win this battle and everyone's so excited. Verse number 1 starts and all the people are rejoicing. They can't wait. I think it's really interesting. Then it says that they were rejoicing because the Lord had just delivered them. And then it says, therefore, they gave thanks unto the Lord their God. Yea, and they did fast much and pray much. And usually you think, at least for me, that those two verbs would come before chapter 44. Before the battle began, they fasted and they prayed for strength in the battle. I love that tiny lesson in 4 words that says it's after the battle, they had already won, that they then turned and said, listen, we will fast and pray in gratitude. We will give thanks at the end.
Which is making me think that I can't recall ever fasting in gratitude.
That is literally what I wrote in my margin.
Yeah, and I kind of want to try it. Like I don't think I've ever just. I just want to focus my heart on gratitude. You know, like I feel like I've had a fast before where I haven't been super specific, where I've just been like, Lord, I just need the natural man in me to be weakened. So I'm fasting, or just generally speaking, you're a greater, awareness of your presence. But I just don't ever think I've intently, prayed in gratitude, in gratitude.
Well, and I just love the idea of your offering being a heart of gratitude.
Yeah.
That's what you go into the fasting mindset with. And what's going to happen in the rest of this chapter is this people is going through a really great moment. They're celebrating, they're fasting and praying in gratitude. They're rejoicing. They've won the battle. And then what's going to happen is Alma's going to get Helaman, and he's going to say, hey, come here, Helaman. And he is going to tell him actually really bad news. And he's going to prophesy of the destruction of his people, which would have been really hard to hear, especially in the middle of a battle, that you are dedicating your life to preserve your people, for someone to come up to you and say, hey, actually, in the end, they're all gonna make bad choices, and it's all gonna fall apart, and it's gonna be a disaster. That's how the story ends. And for a minute, I'm like, why did Alma, at the end, he, disappear, he gets taken up in the spirit, and that's the end of Alma. This was his last word. Before he left, he felt like this was the most important thing to say, and I'm like, you have got to be kidding. Don't say that. In the middle, I'm like, that's the worst, pep talk ever. Hey, that's halftime of a basketball game being just so you know, you're gonna lose the rest of the games for this entire season. It's not even just, this game, you will not win a game for the rest of the season. And you're like, don't tell them. Just let them figure it out. Why are you telling them? But before he even mentions that, he asks 3 questions. And he sits Helaman down and he says, listen, do you believe the words which I spake unto you concerning the records which have been kept? And Helaman says, yeah. Yep, I do. I believe them. And then Alma says, do you believe in Jesus Christ, who is on his way? And he says, yeah, I believe everything you told me about Jesus. And then he says, will you keep my commandments? And he says, yep, I will with my entire heart. And I think that is the lesson. Those 3 questions are the lesson of this chapter, because that was a testimony to Helaman that it didn't matter what happened in the end. That he could just absolutely have everything fall apart and destruction would be on its way. But if he knew all of those things, if he believed all of those things, he could believe that the story in the end, the big picture, the bigger plan, could still be a story of redemption, because that's the story of Jesus. And I think that we so often live in these moments, maybe in between the good and the bad, or maybe living in the good and maybe bad's on the way, or maybe hoping for good to be on the way. And we just want to say why? What is happening? What am I going to do? What do I need to be thinking about? And I love that Alma just centered him and said, listen, it does not matter what's coming, and the past is already gone. But what does matter is what you believe.
Yeah.
And if that's what you're thinking about, it'll be okay.
So awesome. Something that you're going to find in the war chapters is this enemy is defeated and then another one rises in his place. And I think you kind of see that in the book of Revelation, where it talks about the 7-headed dragon, where it's just it just feels like evil just shows his face in so many different ways, in so many different places. And we have this new leader that comes, and reading the war chapters almost gets exhausting, because you're just when is this going to end? And sometimes you might write that in your journal and say, when is this going to end? Because this is sometimes it's thing after thing after thing after thing. And it's just there's something about really long war chapters that remind your heart that you're in for the long haul in this one, right? And so you're going to feel that probably when you read through. But there's this new leader whose name is Amalickiah. And we learn about something about humanity that you already know about yourself, where it just says this in verse 8. Thus we see how quick the children of men forget the Lord their God, and how quick to do iniquity. Because we defeated this other guy. And so it feels like, and we had this celebration. And then it's like, why is anybody else still having like any sort of hold on you again? And don't you think that about yourself sometimes, where you're just like, I thought I rooted that out of me. And here it is again. And that is just true about people, that we are quick to forget the Lord our God and quick to do iniquity. Our hearts are easily flattered and easily led away. And because that is the case, this is what Captain Moroni does about it. I even put above verse 12, I put so ... because of what happened, here's the solution to forgetting. He says, he takes a piece of his coat and he writes on it, in memory of our God, our religion and freedom, our peace, our wives, and our children, and he fastened it upon a pole. And what he did was wrote down the greater cause. He wrote down, he's going to call it in verse 15 or 16, the cause of the Christians. The thing that their hearts long for, that sometimes it's just easy to forget. And he inspires them with those things that they care so much about and that are so meaningful to them. And he puts them on a banner that stands as a physical reminder for those feelings and for those things that they believe, because it's so easy to forget them. And I just feel like there's something about like when our eyes can see something, that it can serve as like as a reminder, especially if we endow that physical object with meaning. You know, if we give it meaning, because really this is this junky old piece of his coat, you know? It's probably dirty and stuff. and I don't know why he uses that. But he puts it on there and all of a sudden it becomes this symbol of a reminder. It's something to stir up their hearts to remember the things that they care. What was that line in there? That were most dear unto us. Yeah. Right? I feel like I've heard this before with in some situation I was in with somebody when they were talking about whenever they're like a wedding ring or a necklace or a bracelet or a something that they can just kind of like touch and remember that, like, oh yeah, I kind of need to be like re-sparked and reminded again about those things that I'm passionate about. Grace and I just went on some HXP trips, and this is something that I was kind of like observing when I was there and thinking about the fact that like everybody gets there day one. We both built schools. Grace was building one in Peru, and I was building someone somewhere, and I just didn't feel like we needed all the lists, because I went to several places and I was about to list them all, and I was like, actually, I'm not going to do that. That part didn't matter. That's why that came out weird.
David's trying to be really sneaky. He's like, I'm supposed to know. He's lying. I'm just kidding.
Anyways, that wasn't going to be the point. The point, so I gave it up. The point was this, that like day one you get there and everyone is so excited and they're fighting over who wants to do what job and everyone wants a shovel. And then you get like 5 days in and you are hot and stinky and sweaty.
And you're like passing the shovel as fast as possible. Yeah, you're like, oh, here, yeah, you can have a shovel.
And it's like, oh, and then you wake up and it's time to go to the work site and you're sort of like, oh. And I noticed something in our leaders there, that how awesome they were at re-inspiring and reminding everybody the cause that they were there for and the reason they were doing what they were doing. Like, we can get so caught up in monotony of even like the really good things. And I think we're learning something here about the importance of like the pageantry and the intention in helping it re-inspire people. Because he dresses up in his full armor to go present this to people. He's creating like a moment.
So precious to me, because I love like imagining him being like, oh, I have a great idea. He's like, let me get really ready.
He just gets all dressed up. I actually think it's really cool in 13 that he dresses up for prayer first. So that's something I like noticed this time for the first time, was like that he fully dressed and then went to God in prayer. And I was like, oh, there's something about that he's just elevating this moment. And he reminds everybody about what it means to be a Christian, to be true believers of Christ who belong to his church, who are faithful and believers, and we gladly take upon us his name. And we have a cause, something that's worth fighting for. That verse always reminds me of 1 Samuel 17, when little David comes to the battlefield and nobody's fighting against Goliath because fear has captured their heart. And David asked this question, is there not a cause? And essentially it's his way of saying something else needs to capture our hearts. It cannot be fear. We need, and it needs to be good. It needs to be good. It's got to be something that really does win our hearts over. I remember this pastor, John Piper's his name, talking about, he has this kind of strategy of when temptation comes. And I liked it because I remember growing up being taught, like, oh, if you feel like temptation comes or you feel anger or bitterness, like sing a hymn, you know? But like sometimes like some of the hymns just don't do it for you, you know? So you can't like pick them. That would be a bad strategy. You're just like sing a hymn. I was like, well, not any of them. You know, you have to pick the one that like actually moves you and is like meaningful to you. And he was talking about like capturing an image of the Savior in your mind, but then he actually taught and said, but it has to be one that moves you emotionally. It can't just be any picture. It has to be one that captures the heart. And there has to be ideas, and there has to be a cause that really captures you know, your emotions and your mind. And you're going to see that with like the different leaders, you know, for good and for bad. They're really good at inspiring the heart. And I think he does that with this title of liberty, and he waves it and he cries out to everyone and he invites everyone to come in. And then I think there's some great strategy in that too, that he's just not pulling in one. He's just like, everybody come.
For sure.
Because there's something about us reminding each other and encouraging each other in our faith and spending time with each other and hearing like about the goodness of God from each other that can be so inspiring. In fact, I actually think like one of the anchor points to my like belief in the Book of Mormon is a friend of mine's testimony of it. Like the way she talked about it and continues to talk about it is so inspiring to me. That it was just like her, like, so there's something about that. And it's actually our tender mercy for the week, which is one of the reasons I bring that up because of those verses in 28 and 31 where he gathered them all together. Where he's just like, let's remind ourselves of this all together. And it's just a rally. It's a really, really cool rallying together that he does that's like so awesome in this chapter. So that's also our word, P.S., because this is what's fun. You'll have this up in your house as a reminder of this title of liberty, this idea of like free to choose what it is that you're going to focus on, free to choose what it is that you're going to believe, free to choose what it is that you're going to put your whole heart, might, mind, and soul into. And this one is pretty cool to hang up, but I think another idea, obviously with this chapter that you may have thought of, is to create titles of liberty, because Moroni, it says, hangs them. He puts them up in verse 36 on every tower in the land as a continual reminder to them of their cause, of who God is, of who they are. You find out in verse 23 and 24. Isn't that kind of, there's something cool where he's like, let me remind you who you are. Let me remind you who our God is. And let me remind you the cause that we are fighting for. And let me do it in a way that inspires you. And you could take a big piece of cloth or something and write something on it together as a class or a family or individually. Or you might just take something else that you give meaning and significance to. And you're like, this will serve as a reminder. I'm going to put it on my shelf. The beginning of a school year is coming up. What are you going to hang up in your house that's a reminder of your cause in all the bedrooms and every tower? It's just like we need that constant reminder. It can't just be one time.
Well, and I think it's so cool. I just was thinking I want to do this for me, so maybe you want to do it too. And especially, I think with teenagers or youth, that most of my most tender experiences with God growing up happen in the summer at FSY or Trek or humanitarian trips or girls camp or whatever you're going on. I feel like those are very foundational experiences in a relationship with God. And I think then what happens is that in November you forget that ever even happened, and then in May when you find out you have to go again, you're like the saddest person ever. You're like, I can't. And I just think how cool would it be if your goal this week was just to sit down with your family and say, okay, I want you to find a physical representation of an experience you had recently.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what are you going to get? And maybe they're going to need help printing out a picture. Maybe they're artistic. They want to paint something, a moment that happened to them. Maybe they want to go back to the place if it's nearby and like press flowers from there. Or maybe you want to get like, maybe they went to a different country. They want to like put money in a frame just to like remind them or whatever. And just like put that somewhere that they can see every single day. Because I would bet that there are a lot of people that have had very transformative experiences within the last 3 months, some that they might not even know how to talk about yet. And I think this could be such a cool moment to hear a story that you might not have heard yet, especially one that is very tender to their relationship with God, and then help them find something that will make sure they never forget it. We are so prone to forgetting. It already told us that in this chapter. How cool would it be to help them find something that gets them excited about remembering that experience with God?
You just made me remember this lady I met in the Cook Islands. So my mother and father-in-law were there serving as missionaries, so we went over to go see them. And we went over to her house, and there were seashells all over her house, like on all the shelves and the window seals, and just like so many of them there. And I was like, "Oh, do you love seashells?" Like, obviously, you know.
She's like, no.
Or something like that. I probably said I said it in a better way, you know? And then she was just like, "Oh, I collect a seashell every time I see the face of God as a reminder." And so all of her memories with God are captured when she sees all of those seashells. And then little Jane got baptized there when we were there, and she came to the baptism. And I like walked behind her back to the house after, and I saw her lean over and pick up a seashell to take back to her house. Isn't that so darling? But I just love
Excuse her.
that all those, she just, on every tower, she had that reminder. And she could probably tell you the story associated with every one of them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really smart, really, really good piece of advice to let someone like reflect on that, remind that. And it kind of is a way of just digging that up again, stirring that up again. Like, oh, this was a beautiful experience for me, you know?
Yeah.
Thanks for letting me say it again. No one may say that, but maybe they think it.
And
you know?
even the fact that I would say that one of the things that most people I feel like that are my age or even younger, is that it's really hard for them to place a moment that they felt God interact in their life. And I think I hear that all the time. I don't feel like God's ever talked to me. I don't feel like I've ever seen God show up in my life. And so many of those experiences are happening this summer. I could promise you, so many experiences happened this summer, and you do not want them to forget those.
Yeah.
You don't
Right.
want those to go forgotten within the next 6 months. Help them find something that they're stoked about. Get them so excited about their treasure.
It's awesome.
This next chapter, I feel sad that I have to be in charge of it because it's kind of a freaky chapter. It's a little bit scary, everyone. It's fine, no problem. I truly wrote at the top of my chapter 47 how evil enters subtly. And that's kind of a scary like intro into this chapter, and honestly this chapter is kind of scary, but what happens is it's going to introduce us in verse number 4 of chapter 47 to a man named Malachi. And to me, Malachi is a really good representation of how evil enters our lives today.
Yeah.
And he's described as being a very subtle man to do evil. Subtle is such an interesting word for me. I think because I have personally never really met anyone that I would dare say is like super excited about evil and like wants to like make bad decisions. Even like I don't feel like I've ever met anyone that is like super like, I want to make all the worst decisions in the whole entire world. I just feel like we are good in our hearts at nature. And which is why I think this chapter is so relevant. Is because I think that is Satan's biggest tool right now, is to try to get us subtly and to try to allow evil to enter our lives subtly. And this story, I think, describes that really well. I went through in mine and I underlined all the ways that I think he does it. I'll kind of describe the story to you and point out different verses and what I think that looks like. Because what happens is this man Malachi decides that he gets this plan in his heart that he wants to dethrone the king of the Lamanites. That's his overall plan. Big picture, he wants to take down the king of the Lamanites. And what happens is he starts his plan, and already from the beginning you see his subtleness. His plan is not to go in there and like with a sword and take over the throne. What he does first is gain favor in the eyes of the king. That's his first move, is to gain favor, not just with the king, but with all of the people that didn't like the king. And I just think that's such an interesting, already you see the subtleness that his goal was not to make enemies. His goal was to make friends, to become familiar and someone you're comfortable around.
And isn't that interesting that like you would normally say, what a great person who's trying to become friends with everyone. They're a peacemaker. They're bridging the gap between them. And just that subtlety is just, it's a little bit creepy that you're just like, oh, I would actually make you employee of the month.
Yeah.
You know, because you're befriending everybody and doing such a good job where, it would be if that was his intention. And what you didn't see under the surface was a totally different purpose for it.
100%. And then what's going to happen is he makes this plan. And he, there's this other enemy, like this other like army that is like at the top of this hill. And he's going to go to try to get them kind of all part of the plan. And his move in verse number 10. Oh, were you going to say something?
No, okay.
Sorry. His move in verse number 10 is he decides to go at night when he could go in secret. And I think already you start seeing the subtleness, not just the fact that he wants to like make moves in secrecy. His like big game plan is to go in a moment of secrecy, but also he's going to start asking for the leader. His name's Lahantai. And I think it's so fascinating that he realizes that Lahantai has higher odds of coming to meet him in night when the people he's surrounded with won't know he left. And I think that is such a similar move to how Satan brings evil into our lives right now, is trying to do it when no one else will protect you. And I think that's such like that scares me because it's like, wait, I want to be surrounded by good people, but Satan's so smart at even being like, okay, well, I'm going to come then when they're not around. Yeah. And so he goes and he's like, okay, it's the middle of the night. He sends a message to Lahantai. He's like, Lahantai, come meet me at the bottom of the mountain. Like, I'm here. Like, let's talk. Let's chat. And Lahantai's like, no, like, I'm not doing it. Not for me. And then in verse number 11, no problem, he says, I'll come again. No problem, let me send another message. Come meet me at the bottom of the mountain. And Lahantai's like, no, I'm not going. And then he sends a third message. And Lahantai still says no. And already, right there, I think it's such an important lesson to realize that even when you say no, that's not the end of the story. Mm-hmm. That, like, you're taught, like, oh, say no, say no, say no. Lahantai did. Lahantai did say no, and then it came again and again and again and again. And I think that's one of like Satan's greatest tools is repetition. That is not something, it's easy to say no once, it gets a lot harder with persistence. And that is something about him, is he's going to go ahead and he's going to be persistent.
And I think that's like, there's something really valuable to that, you know, it's like, well, it's working. So I sort of want to just borrow his plan, but use it for good, you know? And it's just like, we need persistence. You know, Moroni understood that, where he's just like, keep inspiring them, keep reminding them, keep them stirred up in things that are good. And I just think, you know, same thing. I'm thinking about this as a dad, or it's just like, am I consistently inspiring? Am I consistently reminding? Am I consistently like stirring up my kids in, you know, preparing them and giving them a better cause and something to believe in?
Well, and I even think, for me, the fact that Satan's going to try 3 times means that, for me, the God I believe in will try 4. Mm-hmm. And as no matter what happens, if Satan's going to be that persistent in pursuit of my heart, I know that God will be more. Yeah. And I love that is just as true for our God. And he plays, I think, a lot less subtle than Satan does. He is bold in his pursuit of us. And then he goes, and finally Amalekite, he is just so smart, which just like almost makes you sick to your stomach, because then he's like, okay, well, great. If you're not going to come all the way down to the mountain, I will come up nearly to your camp. I will try to almost meet you exactly where you are. And I will make you just step down a little bit. And he goes up. And finally, when he goes up that time, Lahantai's like, okay, great, whatever. At least I don't have to climb the whole mountain up once I'm done. And I think that is such the art of subtlety. trying to like bring evil into your life. That if you're not going to step all the way down, he is going to meet you 3/4 the way and say, okay, then just give up a little bit.
Yeah.
Just give me this much. And that's going to be that. And he goes and he comes down, and Malachi convinces him to let him be second in command, and he agrees. Lahantai's like, great, you can be second in command. And then he goes back down to his army. They're surrounded. They don't know he's second in command. They all surrender to Lahantai's army, and then they kind of become this whole big group. And then what happens is Amalekite, this is verse number 18. In verse number 18, Amalekite poisons Lahantai by degrees. Little by little by little by little is the death of Lahantai. And then he kind of takes over, and that's the like story there. But I just cannot help but think that you saw the degrees start in verse number 4 of this story. And little by little by little by little is how he brought evil into the game. And I just think that this is such a strong example of evil entering into our lives. But I also think that like once you see this, you can, like, this is exactly what Moroni has done. I feel like all of these chapters, when you know that this is how it's going to work, it's a little bit easier to make a game plan to stop it.
Yeah, I think you might want this cross-reference. Maybe you know this or have it already next to Alma 47:12 is that story from the Old Testament of Nehemiah in a really similar situation.
Yep.
Where he's trying to be brought down from his mountain. But I just love that he uses this phrase in Nehemiah 6:3. He says, I am doing a great work, so I cannot come down. And again, it's that idea of what's your cause? What is it that's inspiring your heart, that's leading you to be able to say, no, I cannot step down. I have something better. And I think that's so important. And I think we're gonna keep seeing that more and more. This next section is going to be your favorite only because of what it's called, Hell Shaker. And this is what I love. You read chapter 47 and you get a little bit nervous about the subtlety of evil. And you just kind of think, oh my gosh, man, you could be tricked so easily. Like I didn't know that, the adversary was so like sneaky, and it almost like makes you a little bit afraid. And I think 48 is kind of response to that a little bit, as you find out kind of the idea at the very beginning of what I was just saying of find your cause. Because look at what it says. Amalickiah, he says, inspires the hearts of the Lamanites to speak for, and he sets people up on all their towers to keep doing that. Verse 2, he inspires their hearts. Verse 3, he's got a design over their hearts and over their mind, and he's stirring them up. He's determined in that. In verse 4, and so you just kind of have to think to yourself, evil is doing a really good job of inspiring people. Like there are a lot of really good messages out there that are crafted so well to just like draw upon like the emotions of people and the thoughts of people. And I just love that you have a response to that. A response to that in Moroni. And I think we can learn a lot from Moroni in that he is going to do the same exact thing. The line, well, it's true, is just not going to cut it anymore. Like we have to inspire people to a better belief. Why will they not give up their faith? What is it that's so beautiful and wonderful and amazing about being a person of faith and believing? What's so good about the good news? Like we have to be really good at inspiring the hearts of people, particularly verse 9, what Moroni does in the weakest fortifications, right? Prepare their minds, he says in verse 7, prepare to support them that they might live unto the Lord their God. Like, I just think we learned something from, the enemy's side that we have to be more vigilant in that. And you learn about Moroni and what an impact he has. It says, he was such a strong and mighty man in verse 11, a man of perfect understanding, a man who did not delight in bloodshed, but his soul did joy in liberty. His heart swelled with thanksgiving to his God for the many privileges and blessings. He labored exceedingly for the welfare and the safety of this people. He was firm in the faith of Christ. He was a promise keeper, and he was true to his oath. He was a man of great faith who believed wonderful things about God. And I just believe that whenever there's an Amalickiah in the world, God is going to send a Moroni. And someone to inspire us. And maybe that person is us. And we can think that way. How can I be a person described in verse 11 and 12 and 13? It talks about this was the faith of Moroni, and it's hard to glory in it in 16. It's worth asking, what is my faith and what do I glory in? What is my cause? He had his, and what is mine? And I love that God sends Moronis, that God sends people like this to inspire and uplift and encourage and just breathe hope and fan the flames of faith within people. And then I love this part that comes right after, right? In verse 18 it says, he was like Ammon and the other sons of Mosiah and Alma and his sons. And then it says, now behold, Helaman and his brethren were no less serviceable unto the people than was Moroni. So Moroni's types of gifts and leadership style might not be yours. His position in the army or in the church might not be yours. But that doesn't mean you're any less serviceable than him. You will use your gifts and your opportunities and your ways of doing it, and you will combat evil. As subtle and creepy as the adversary is in 47, we learn in 17 that one good man or one good woman has the power that if all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever, and the devil would have no power, never have power over the hearts of the children of men. That's the promise. That's the promise, that that there are hell shakers among us, and you and I can be one of them. We are no less serviceable, even if our position isn't up front and waving the flag like Moroni's is. God has not left us empty-handed in this battle. And 49 shows like the results of that the evil, the Lamanite army was disappointed. They were like, whoa, they were shocked at how prepared and how deep and high their preparations were.
Beautiful. The last few chapters of this section kind of began in chapter 50 with this moment in between battles. And they had just won. They were feeling really good. And we all know how the rest of this book goes. There were truly going to be more battles on the way. And as I was studying this, I found in my notes app. So who knows where this came from? Everyone, if you know, perfect. I don't, because it could have been sacrament meeting or a podcast or my mind. So it's a surprise. But I just found it in my notes app, and it just was like, usually the reward for a battle won is a bigger battle. And it feels like that is something that Moroni knew to be true. Because this feels like the moment that he says, we just won a battle. That probably means another is on the way. Take that as a compliment and be ready. And he starts in verse number 1, and it says, and now it came to pass that Moroni did not stop. I circled that, and he just did not stop making preparations for war or to defend his people. And I love that in a moment that he could have let his guard down, he instead decided to not stop working. And I feel like this is another really good battle-ready chapter. If that is how you are reading, this is a really good place to go. Because he is going to go through and he says all of the things that he did when other leaders could have decided to pause and stop and take a break and say, phew, we did it. Great. He decided we will be more ready next time. We will keep going. And you see all sorts of different things that he does. In verse number 4, he builds towers to overlook everything and make sure everything's going well. I think that's a really cool thought to just stop and say, okay, if I were to look at everything going on in my life, what are the places that things are going well and what are the places that things look a little bit less good?
That's awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah, in verse number 6, you see he prepared strongholds against the coming of their enemies. I remember growing up, my parents, I don't even know when it was, but they made us draw on a paper a square. This is so dumb, and it probably wasn't a square, but I drew a square, and in all the corners, I don't know what the lesson was, so I don't even know why I'm saying this because it's fine, everyone, but in all the corners of my square, I had to write 4 things that I was sure about, 4 things that I was really secure in my beliefs, and I wrote those truths down, and I still remember them, and that was so many years ago, and I just think that's such a cool moment that He did it like physically with buildings or whatever. And what if we did that for ourselves? And we said, these are my strongholds. These are what I will hold on to. When I'm uncertain about other things, I can grab on to these. And in verse number 7, it says that they drove out all the Lamanites. They pushed them as far away as they possibly could. And I just love the idea of just getting rid of all the threats. Even if it's not something that's necessarily causing major issues, what are the things that are threatening your peace and where you're at right now? And just get rid of them. Just choose to just get rid of them. And it could be physical things. It could be people that you follow on Instagram that make you feel like garbage. And maybe it's like whatever it possibly could be, just get rid of the threats. That's it.
And that feels like it's in response to like those towers, right? Climb your towers, take an overlook, look at what's going on. And then now, what do I need to strengthen and what do I need to get rid of?
For sure.
Right?
For sure. And then what's going to happen in verse number 9 is not only did they get rid of all of those things, but then it says that they went and they discover more places. They find new areas to go and inhabit, and even to the borders by the seashore, and possess the land. And something that I think is really powerful is realizing that there are moments that you get rid of something, but you have got to replace it with something else. Find something good to replace it with. Your heart is obviously longing for something. Your heart needs something. That's why you're turning to those places. So yeah, get rid of those. That's great. Perfect. But find something else to replace it with. I think it goes back to that story of Nehemiah. The difference was,
right, I was just thinking that.
Yeah, he stayed up there because he had a great work to do. Lahontai went down because he didn't even mention what he was doing up there. And I just think that's such a good lesson, that fill your time with things that you are passionate about and doing good.
Yeah, I just think saying yes to something is way more powerful and drawing than saying no to something else.
For sure.
You know? Like it's the difference between I'm a person who doesn't do this versus I'm a person who does this.
Yeah.
Because I'm a person who does this encompasses both. Like,
Yeah.
that took a minute to find that word, right? Where it's like, because I do this, this, and this, that's why I don't do this, this, and this.
For
right?
sure.
And so it feels like this is like, that was what Moroni was doing. Here's my cause. Here's the purpose. Here are the things that inspire it. Here's the things we're fighting for.
100%. He goes through, and in verse number 11, he cuts off all the ties to the Lamanites, all the strongholds to them. And I just love that thought of, what do you need to cut off? What do you, like, what has a pull on your heart that you need to get rid of, that you can just step away from? And verse number 12, I think this is such a really powerful thought. He says that his armies increased daily because of the protections that they had made. And it reminds me of that cycling team that like got 1% better every single day.
Yeah. That's
what it feels like. It's just an increase daily. Get a little bit better day by day by day. And what happens in the end is verse number 23. At a time in between battles, when they are preparing for another battle, which means that they feel like they can almost like fill one on the way, this is what they have to say about their time. But behold, there never was a happier time among the people of Nephi, even since the days of Nephi, than in the days of Moroni, yea, even at this time. And I think that that is such a hopeful promise, that in the midst of battles, you can still say there was never a happier time. And I think that, to me, is such a call and promise to become battle ready. Because in the process of becoming battle ready is the moment that you can confidently say that you are happy.
Yeah, and I've just been thinking here just that to be how happy they were in the times of Moroni, right? To be under his leadership, to be under his wisdom, to be under his direction, and what a type of Christ he is. Jesus, the great captain of our souls. You know, in the very beginning of that chapter, when you says Moroni did not stop, I wrote at the top of my margin, God did not stop. Like we see in him a type and a shadow of, if we're under the direction, under the banner, and under the cause of the Savior, that's where we'll find, that's when hell will shake. That's when we'll find the happiness. That's when we'll be defended, and because of who he is. And it's what made Moroni strong, right? We saw that in the chapter, you know, and the same can be true for all of us. So, and more of that next week, and get double excited because it's the 2060 Stripling Warriors. So we'll see you next week.